Code 3, all officers stay down. Shots are being fired from AK-47.
It's a crime soaked in American history, coinciding with the country's expansion westward, immortalized in screaming headlines and, of course, Hollywood movies. Between 1850 and 1920, career criminals like Jesse James, John Dillinger, and Butch Cassidy gained infamy for their bold bank heists. Or what about the Bonnie and Clyde of the 1930s? Speaking of Hollywood, I remember going to Blockbuster as a young boy with a childhood friend and somehow convincing his mom to rent us this R-rated action movie. That movie was Heat. Now, Heat wasn't the most appropriate movie for a 10-year-old boy, but we didn't care. All the more reason. Duh. If it had guns, killing, and explosions, we were watching it. So in Heat, mastermind criminal Neil McCauley, played by the one and only Robert De Niro, is planning one last big bank heist before retiring. I mean, it's not just about that, there's a whole backstory with different characters, but anyways, there's this iconic shootout scene that takes place in the streets between the perpetrators and law enforcement that is really the best part of the whole movie. It felt so freaking realistic. It wasn't like those cheesy Arnold movies from the 80s. In fact, the movie Heat even impressed some experts. Apparently, the Marines would show new recruits the shootout scene as part of their training, because that's how accurate the representation was. But on the flip side of that, the film's accurate representation also inspired two men to rob a bank. Let's go back to the 90s for a second, where America was in the grips of the largest surge of bank robberies in decades. And this place was ground zero. On Friday, February 28, 1997, the Los Angeles Police Department would face one of the most dangerous criminal acts in its history. It would later famously be known as the North Hollywood Shootout. But anyways, on that Friday morning, after months of planning, two armed men entered and robbed the North Hollywood Bank of America branch in California.
We have a possible 211 in progress at the Bank of America. Bank of America, located north of Kittredge. We have shots fired.
They would eventually exit the building and unleash 44 minutes of hell on the LAPD. The two men involved were Larry Phillips and Emil Matassarano. These guys had some serious balls. They were two amateur bodybuilders who met at the Gold's Gym and shared a fascination with none other than the 1995 bank heist movie, Heat. So anyways, yeah, that was the infamous North Hollywood Shootout. This kind of bank robbery would be defined as a takeover, a well-crafted and well-planned heist, a big score. But not every bank robbery was glamorized by movies like Heat. Most robberies were a crime of desperation, and no other place could hold a candle to the city of Los Angeles, embroiled in fear and uncertainty over its rise as the bank robbery capital of the world. Between 1985 and 1995, LA retail bank branches were robbed some 17,106 times. In 1992, the city had its worst year, an astonishing 2,641 robberies. This roughly works out to one bank robbery every 45 minutes of each banking day. So yeah, those are some serious numbers for that time, but the question I have is, why Los Angeles? I mean, there are other big cities across the country with big populations as well. Why not them? Was it sheer size? I mean, LA's like 10,000 square miles and close to 17 million people reside there. But size and population doesn't explain its position at the top of the bank robbery stack.
Here we go.
There are a few phenomenons at play here. Let's start with the first one, cars. Cars is the first one. A culture of Southern California itself.
Los Angeles has more cars than any city in the world. More than Chicago or London or New York or anywhere.
LA has over 6 million vehicles and over 1,000 miles of freeway to cruise on, creating a landscape ideal for bank robberies.
You can spot them at a glance by their smooth flowing lines.
The Southern California car culture also contributed to the problem in more indirect ways as well. With businesses popping up at the bottom of every other free ramp, the days of running hours of errands all over the city were coming to a close.
The convenience of nearly twice as many branches statewide. Most have walk-up or drive-up windows where you can bank early and late at Bank of America.
People didn't want to do their banking in some massive granite-walled fortress downtown anymore. These small retail banks was where it was at. The problem was many of them had little to no security, like the traditional banks. Another huge issue is where they were located. Many of them right next to prime getaway routes. I mean, these branches became a huge problem in the 80s and 90s.
He's wanted because he's just done a bank robbery. There are several, looks like Border Patrol in front of Rehder.
But Wells Fargo wants them caught. The bank's offering a $5,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest and conviction.
And then, cocaine showed up on the scene.
More and more of what is found is cocaine, believed to be the next major drug problem.
It's become the #1 illicit drug in the United States. Cocaine. Cocaine.
Cocaine.
Cocaine is now becoming the in drug from the Bowery to Beverly Hills.
Cocaine emerged back on the scene in the late 70s as this fashionable new drug for people in the entertainment industry. Really, people with money. During the 1970s disco era, this drug was marketed very, very well. People loved it.
It's the forbidden fruit. It's cocaine.
It's fun, entertaining.
Yeah, when cocaine made its run through the 1980s club scene, it was really glamorized. I mean, rock stars, movie stars, of course porn stars, they weren't afraid to flaunt their coke use. And many people wanted to be them. They wanted to be that. They wanted that life. I mean, after all, this is a city where seemingly anyone could be a star. But not for long. Something happened throughout the 80s. Once again, the guy who sort of revolutionized drug smuggling and built a cocaine empire, Pablo Escobar, founder and sole leader of the Medellin cartel, which distributed powder cocaine, a lot of powdered cocaine. In the 80s, it was estimated Escobar smuggled 70 to 80 tons of cocaine into the US every month via Colombia, quickly making him one of the richest people in the world, an estimated net worth of around $30 billion. Well, now you're probably thinking, what's this have to do with robbing banks? Well, a lot actually. You see, before Pablo, cocaine had only trickled through the US border in relatively small consignments, using mules to carry product over in suitcases and even in their body cavities. But Escobar had somehow transformed smuggling into a real professional business, exporting huge amounts of cocaine by the plane load with other revolutionaries like Carlos Rehder. So now we have this newfound organization that is amazingly effective at smuggling cocaine. Next thing you know, there's way too much of it coming over the border now. Drug cartels quickly begin flooding the market with the white powder, and the prices plummeted, as much as 80% in some places. So now, for the first time ever, cocaine was in the price range of the common man. It's affordable. That's great. Everyone can have a great time now. Well, there's a downside to this, and trust me, nobody likes coming down. Cocaine can be a highly addictive drug. It's a central nervous system stimulant that affects the brain by stimulating high levels of dopamine, a brain chemical associated with pleasure and reward. And often, frequent users unfortunately may develop a dependency on it, meaning they need to have it to feel normal. So when the common man needs to feel normal all the time, he runs out of money fast. And if the common man couldn't kick his habit, he went out looking for more of both. And this was the period the city of Los Angeles began to get its reputation. By the end of the 1970s, bank robberies shot up 71%, 6,000 in 1980 alone, nationwide. These criminals were no longer the typical John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde archetypes. It was the average middle-class businessman, construction worker, and small business owners that were robbing banks. These are probably people that in their right mind would have never thought to commit a crime, period. But because they were so addictive driven, the risk was worth the next hit. That's how desperate they were. I mean, let's take this guy for instance. Eddie Dodson, aka the Yankee Bandit. Dodson was a mild-mannered, likable person who moved to California and operated a successful and trendy antique shop. He was really into the Hollywood hipster scene for over a decade, partied with celebrities, models, and designers. And when Dodson started sniffing coke, it didn't take long for this nasty habit to get out of control. In July of 1983, Dodson, a man with no previous police record whatsoever, walked into the Crocker National Bank in Larchmont and pulled his first bank heist. He would hit several more, often wearing the same baseball cap during the heist, which ended up earning him the nickname the Yankee Bandit, and apparently a very apologetic criminal as well. Within 9 months, Dodson had robbed 64 banks, which is the largest number of banks in the US robbed by a single person. And within that 9-month period, Dotson had scored more than $250,000, a pretty big number for that time. But all that money would go to feeding his drug habit, spending up to $15,000 a week, but his luck would eventually run out. In 1984, Dotson was finally arrested and convicted, and was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but only actually served 10. But Dotson's story was just one small part of the whole bank robbery capital of the world era. By 1985, local LA bank robberies had shot up past 1,000, and by 1990 it would jump another 56%, with an estimated 85% of those robbers being addicted to one drug or another. And although obviously this was becoming a huge problem, most of these robberies rarely ended in violence. Like I said, these were average people, not violent. They were just desperate addicts. So despite the seriousness in which law enforcement was treating the soaring bank robbery rates, it never rose to the level of concern of other problems they had on their hands, such as gang violence and domestic abuse.
There is a recklessness in today's gang wars that make even the prohibition battles of the 1920s pale by comparison. It is worse, of course, in some places than others. Among the worst of all is Los Angeles.
Banks were starting to see the entire staff of terrorized branch employees quit as a whole. The cost of hiring and retraining all new employees to take their place was becoming enormous. And then there were the workmen's comp claims. By the end of 1992, losses related to bank robberies exceeded those from fraud for the first time ever. Soon after, the banks began hardening their targets. Plexiglass barriers came back up, doors leading to the vault and teller area were reinforced, and access control units automatically locked vaults and ATM machines so that they could not be reopened. Some were even equipped to trap the thief inside the vault. Soon bank robbery was looking like more risk for a lot less reward. It just so happens that around this time, an extremely controversial policy implemented throughout the federal judicial system began to have its impact felt. The 1989 Federal Uniform Sentencing Guidelines all but obliterated a parole system that had been spitting out even die-hard bank robbers back onto the streets, an average of 3 to 5 years after convicted. The system was a revolving door. The same guys were getting caught over and over again. Worse, they were coming out better bandits than when they had gone in. The federal prison was loaded with bank thieves. Whatever tricks they did not know on the outside, they learned on the inside. But these new guidelines allowed for much longer sentences, even for small-time robberies. And offenders can forget about parole. It mandated a minimum of 85% of a sentence being served before being eligible. The customary sentence for a bank robbery was now 20 years with a minimum of 17 served, and that's without using a gun. Dangerous offenders began to disappear from the scene. In 1993, the number of LA bank robberies dropped by more than a third to 1,674, from 2,641 the year before. And the numbers just kept going down as the hardcore criminals disappeared into the prison system. And drug users were actually dropping out of the game. The raw horrors of crack addiction had stripped away all the glamour originally associated with cocaine. And by 1997, bank robberies had declined by 70% from their 1992 high. If you guys enjoyed the video, please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. You can also support my channel on Patreon. Thanks again.